This is Cameron Murray, and I'm recording my video for ACTE 699 regarding data collection techniques. My technique is the checklist technique. So just a general overview here. This answers the first question: how would you describe this data collection technique, and what processes and procedures are unique to this technique? So first of all, just a general description. The checklist technique includes a list of observable behaviors, skills, characteristics, traits, etc. So it can be really anything that is observable. And then there's a checklist tied to it with a checkbox for whether or not the behavior, technique, skill, characteristic, etc. is observed or unobserved. So it really is just a checkbox tied to a behavior of some sort, something observable. The second thing I want to talk about is how this is a technique that kind of mutates with surveys and observation, or it is a mutation of those two. Obviously, it's not directly related to either of these, but this is kind of how I saw it. So in terms of surveys and how it's similar to those, surveys provide quantifiable data, as does the checklist technique. They also provide predetermined questions or topics, just like the checklists do, and it quantifies behaviors or traits that are observed. In the case of surveys, they would be questions that could pertain to behaviors or traits, but whether or not they are behaviors or traits is really irrelevant, because it's tying a qualitative concept into something that is measurable, making it quantifiable. So it is very similar to surveys, but it's not quite the same, primarily because of how we are recording the information pertaining to the questions that we're asking. In terms of observation, obviously checklists are going to require observation because you are observing something, usually a behavior, a trait, a characteristic of something, a skill even. And observation is very qualitative. And in this sense, checklists do include qualitative data, or could, but they are quantified because we are just using a checkbox for observed or unobserved behaviors. They differ from observation more specifically in that there is no field note aspect, and so I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but this relates to the fact that checklists aren't very specific and really focus only on a yes-no question. Question 2 asked if it is a qualitative or quantitative technique, and then what types of questions it would best answer. So checklists are a quantitative method. They focus on measuring behaviors, skills, traits, etc., as I said before. The key information here is that we may have qualitative questions that we're asking, but we're only really observing them in terms of whether or not they happened. Asking the question, did this happen? It's not what happened or why did it happen, but did this happen? So it is quantitative. Very similar to surveys, as I said before as well, in that surveys can include qualitative questions, so questions that ask things that are more open-ended, but they really examine them from a quantitative perspective. So checklists also limit the data collected, like I said, because they are really just looking at, was this observed or was it unobserved? And they also answer comparative and general questions about your research topic. So if you have questions about comparisons, or you want to guide your research a little bit more, they do come in handy. They can also provide event or behavior-oriented comparisons. So tying back into the types of things that you are trying to observe or see if they happen or don't happen. But again, this all just leads back to the fact that it is very closed-ended. So it's not an open-ended question strategy. Some of the strengths and weaknesses to answer question 3 of this technique. First, we're going to look at the strengths and advantages. So some of the things that I thought about or considered. Number one, they increase the efficiency of observation. So even if you were using an observation technique, the checklists help you to identify ahead of time things that you definitely want to point out or examine within your classroom. And so because you have that list and you have the ability to just check off whether or not a certain behavior or something was observed, it does simplify and make it more efficient to observe in that sense. It's not as open-ended. It, as I mentioned before, is similar in terms of collecting data to surveys and questionnaires. So this is a plus, and this kind of ties into my third strength here. Because it's similar to that method, but surveys and questionnaires would require IRB approval, this technique does not, and so it kind of gives you that advantage where you can use it without having to get the IRB approval. It is not entirely the same as surveys and questionnaires though, so that should also be considered. Surveys and questionnaires do at least analyze the whatever you're looking for, the behaviors or questions that you're asking. They examine them on a scale typically, and so it is more specific. The checklists are not, and so that leads me into my weaknesses and limitations. Checklists lack detail, so it really is just a black and white situation. It's either yes or no. Did I see it or did I not? Checklists also don't account for student opinion, and again, this kind of ties into that, but whereas surveys and questionnaires could account for the student opinion and the students are filling them out, the teacher researcher would be filling out the checklists based on observations. So it is limiting in detail and also the accounting for student opinion. For example, if you're trying to observe whether or not students are enthusiastic about a certain activity or if they're engaged in something, you can only observe their behaviors. You can't get a student to say, I really like that activity because X, Y, and Z. So it really is just, did I think I observed that? What behaviors am I looking for? And was it observed or was it not? So it is very black and white and lacking detail. The last question about concerns, specifically regarding validity, reliability, and or ethical perspective. So I pointed out a few things here. Number one, a concern is observability. So it obviously isn't a concern if you do this, but you really do need to make sure that your questions or your topics are observable. If they're not, then it can kind of fade into that gray area where you can't actually determine whether or not what you're looking for was really observed or unobserved. So make sure that your questions or characteristics, behaviors, etc. are phrased in a way that they are observable. That's the number one concern that I had. Number two would be accuracy. So in terms of accuracy, if you have a behavior you're observing, make sure that you know exactly what you're going to count towards that observed or unobserved level of measurement. So for example, if a student, again, if you're measuring enthusiasm or engagement or whatever, if a student does something that indicates to you that enthusiasm was observed, then you want to make sure that's consistent across the board and you're not kind of changing that rule as you go for each student. So you really do have to be accurate and, again, specific in what you're trying to measure. The third thing that I pointed out was the quantity. So this is specifically the quantity of items on your checklist. If you have too many, it can be a hassle to go through the checklist in your class. So you want to make sure you only have a handful that you can actually handle, especially if you're observing this through a larger number of students. And then regarding the ethical perspective, data coding is really the #1 way to make this more ethically safe. I didn't see too many concerns regarding ethical matters, but making sure that you code the data or somehow ensure that the students' names will not lead back to the data. But I felt like it was pretty safe and it would be easy to code the data using a spreadsheet of some sort that you can maintain and then destroy or store somewhere that it would not be accessed by other people. So overall, very ethically safe I thought. But those are my outline concerns. I do have a final analysis, so I'm not going to read directly from that. That's just something that I kind of typed up as I was thinking about this question. So I think I will be using the checklist after reviewing it in part of my data collection. I also have an example there of what mine might look like for at least one aspect of my research. But I think it will help to kind of track what strategies my students are using in my research, so whether or not they're using specific activities and perhaps if that would lead to further research. So if I start to notice a trend where students are using one specific activity, even though they all fall within the general category of the strategies I'm observing or examining, it might lead to further research and kind of help to guide my research even later on as I'm kind of trying to process and analyze what happened. I think it is a good strategy for that reason. It also might help to compare, especially if you're observing behaviors within a more specific area of education or maybe strategies of some sort of teaching or learning strategy. It's kind of difficult to explain in such a general way, but I think it is useful in guiding the research and also making those comparisons between student behavior and skill sets. So overall, I think I will be using this. I think it does seem very useful, and I hope that this presentation also helps you to kind of guide you in how you'll collect your data, whether or not you'll use checklists. Thanks for viewing, and I look forward to your feedback.